Hello, everybody. We are back here. Healthcare experience matters. I am super excited to be joined by our guest today. He is Danny Woodburn. Danny, welcome to our show. I want you to tell us a little bit about your childhood growing up, and of course, as we're going to talk about how you got into acting in the arts.
I'm an East Coast guy. I grew up in suburbs of Philadelphia. Probably used my clowning ability, my comedy as a kid to prevent being bullied. Essentially, I think it's a great outlet for a number of comedians that have come up in that way, and I think they just led me to the performance bug. I never really was in the plays in high school, but I took maybe one, drama class as they called it, and then when I went to college, I pursued film and television and theater. And I studied at Temple University in Philadelphia, got my degree. And then I taught at the Freedom Theater, which is an inner city performing arts school. They had summer programs. I taught there for 3 months and then moved to Los Angeles. But I also did some theater in New York prior to leaving, and I did some regional theater in Philadelphia after college. So I did some theater here in New York and some shows in Philly. Aside from my college career, I worked with an improv troupe for a few years, and we did some colleges then, and then moved to Los Angeles. And back then it was all about pounding the pavement and walking into offices and seeing who might be interested. Thinking I came as a big fish in a small pond, thinking I had a great resume. It all this basically came down to, how I presented in the room until I could land the roles that gave me attention.
Yeah, I mean, I could sit here all day and rattle off the movies and television shows you've been in. I'm going to spare you that. I'm going to have people look it up on their own, but I'll just say I'm a major fan of a lot of your work, Danny. I knew who you were before we were put in touch for this interview, and I really want to pivot from although it's always going to be, a part of your story. I do want to pivot from the arts and entertainment kind of background that you have and talk about the advocacy work that you're doing on behalf of disability rights. What point of your life did that become important? And feel free to tell us the whole story on that.
Yeah, I think for me, the advocacy sort of comes down from my mom in a sense. So my mom was always a staunch advocate for me and getting the health care that I needed as a boy, because I had certain needs, having a skeletal dysplasia syndrome, and needing to have a number of osteotomies and be in body casts and recover and learn to walk again, and that was a big part of my childhood and young adulthood. And so I understood what it meant to be an advocate based on my mother, who was a nurse, who did what she could to make sure that I was treated normally, quote unquote, normally by the world, and certainly that I got the care that I needed medically. That people didn't sort of gloss over the fact that I'm different. But still today, even doctors don't all have a grasp of dwarfism, and so they will. I've heard doctors say, "Oh, I think I could try that," with regard to, say, a hip replacement on me or something like that. To hear an orthopod say, "I think I could try that," is a little unnerving. But I think I got it from there, and then of course from my own experience and understanding how people would see me, the prejudices they had around people with dwarfism, the names I was called. So I advocated for myself, and then going into this industry, not being seen as a legitimate actor with experience, but being seen as a sight gag, or being seen as just an object in a sense on screen to be used but not engaged with. It led me to not just advocate for myself, but to think about others in the same category. And I became part of the Performers with Disabilities Committee at SAG-AFTRA, which was at the time, it was just the Screen Actors Guild. So I became part of that committee, and then over the years, came to a better understanding of how people with disabilities in this industry were often overlooked, not given opportunity. Literally laws were being broken with regard to not hiring people with disability. The way in which producers or directors had responded to, say, someone in a wheelchair, if it was any other industry, they would have been sued. But in this industry, in the arts, it's such a fine line of determining what is prejudice and what is art, right? But as the recipient of those prejudices, we knew it wasn't necessarily about art. It was about understanding the fact that a location shoot wouldn't have just physical access to a set, physical access to a dressing room, that these things were overlooked, where the law has been in place for 30 years that access needs to be created for places of employment. Somehow the industry has managed to completely disregard anything in terms of that. And so I wanted to acknowledge, the people in my category, as it were, people with disabilities, who weren't getting a fair shake at opportunities, who weren't being seen, who were being totally overlooked, or who couldn't even get a job playing themselves, right? So you see so many different actors always playing people with disabilities, but you never see the person with the disability, except for, going back to Marley Matlin. You don't see that. You didn't see it on screen. You never saw somebody who was a wheelchair user playing a person who's a wheelchair user. That just didn't happen. And so now we're in a place where we've shifted that paradigm a bit more, and there's an understanding of not only the ability of these performers, but the fact that their rights have been infringed on for so long that it's time to turn the table, reset the dial, as it were.
When you were on Seinfeld, I want to know what you just mentioned, that you wanted to always be considered a serious actor, just a peer of someone on the cast, etc.
Right.
Not be some sort of gag that you might see in decades of yesteryear.
Right.
When you were, if people who haven't seen the series, when you were Kramer's friend, when you were a part of that cast, there was never any, no one ever mentioned anything other than you were just buddies with Kramer. Was that
Right.
novel? Was that novel at the time? Was that just a new kind of thing given the early 90s? I'm so curious about that.
Yeah, that was definitely novel. It was, there was just one moment in the very first episode where George refers to Mickey as a midget, which was, has been for my entire life a derogatory term for little people. It's born out of P.T. Barnum's desire to sell little people for profit in sideshows. It's a made up word. And so it always had derogatory connotations in the community. And so when they mention it, when George says a line, can't you switch with another midget? Originally in the script, Mickey didn't have a reaction to that other than to explain why he could not do that. And I had talked to, Jerry and Larry David, and I said, look, this word is a painful word. It's a hurtful word, and I can't just not acknowledge it. And so as far as acknowledging any aspect of it, that was the only beat in the whole series where it was acknowledged. And it was written in organically and innocently on the part of the writers, but my correction made it more noticeable that we're addressing something here. And as they've always said, there's never been a very special episode of Seinfeld where, lessons get learned. So we had to come up with a way that we teach this lesson without it being a lesson. You know what I mean? And that response from Mickey became volatile, where he walks up to him and he looks like he's about to rip his head off. And he says, it's little people. You got that? And then Michael Richards, Kramer, says, easy, Mickey, easy.
Yeah.
So that organic moment in the series then created the actual persona of Mickey in that moment, that he's this hothead ready to lose it at any point. And then it just escalated from there. So the organic moment that came out of my advocacy created a character that got to come back, because that became like a feature of their relationship, Mickey's volatility,
Yeah. No, that's
But that was the only time it was ever addressed. But to that point that you were making, it was very novel. I mean, I could go over a list of episodes. Small packages, a little murder, all these like sort of small and little terms that were the names of the episodes of so many of the things that I've done. It's almost humorous, to go back and read some of these things. So it was a novel thing at the time, and there's been a number of shows that I've had to address, even further, what's derogatory, what people should understand about dwarfism, etc. I've even rewritten entire episodes of programs to take out so much of what I felt was demeaning, and then created something that had absolutely no acknowledgement of my character's size difference.
Yeah. And you were on and you still might be in this role as part of the Screen Actors Guild Performers with Disabilities Committee. Are you currently still working with them? Tell us about that.
That's what I talked about being part of before, where we're trying to move the needle and change the landscape, and so right now I'm the co-vice chair of that committee. We meet with unions. We set up in the 2010 negotiations of our contract. We changed the languages around disability employment, and we created a task force with producers and the union to look into where producers are missing the boat. And then since that time, I've worked in an advisory capacity to pretty much every studio in town.
And we just mentioned that the Seinfeld story, and I want to know more about any of the other discrimination in your career you might have faced and some of the changes you were able to implement. I'm sure that the Seinfeld story, there's more of those.
Yeah. The list is endless as far as, having to make these changes. I was offered this role on a kids show where my character was sort of, it was a circus character, right? Which I was like, okay, I understand that, that's something that does exist. And but it was a kids show, and the character was constantly coming on to the 14-year-old daughter of the main characters, right? And I, as a man in my probably 30s at that time, thought that was highly inappropriate. He's trying to kiss a child. And I brought that up to the producers before, even considering the role, and they weren't interested in my opinions about it. So they moved on to somebody else who was willing to play that role. So I've stood up in some of those moments and lost a job, and stood up in some of those moments and changed the whole perceptions. I did a number of episodes of Bones, and the very first episode had a lot of misinformation, medical information around dwarfism that I helped correct with the producers. So, there's almost never an episode of something that I've been in that I haven't talked to writers and producers about where they might be missing the mark.
Yeah. And we have a lot of listeners who are interested in delivering excellent patient care, excellent patient experiences. And, I want you to talk to our listeners now in our community. What else would you like them to know about, your story or people that are like you? What are some of the issues that are remaining out there that you would tell that audience?
Well, I think some of the issues are that there's still a lack of understanding regarding employment of people with disabilities in front of and behind the camera. There's I had a meeting. Bryan Cranston did a role on where he's a paraplegic wheelchair user, or a quadriplegic person who uses a wheelchair, and there was a lot of sort of uproar from the community about it. And I approached him, and he said, "Well, I think it's died down." And I said, "No, it hasn't died down, because it's like a thorn in the paw of this community, that this sort of thing keeps happening with no acknowledgement or understanding of why it happens. And so, he agreed to sit down and talk to me, and I explained to him, this is about also access to education for people who want to be in the performing arts. We talk about going to the theater, and the theater is ADA compliant for an audience member to go and enjoy a show, but it's not ADA compliant for a performer to come and learn on that stage. There's not necessarily access. And Ali Stroker helped bring a lot of attention to that fact when she did Oklahoma, won the Tony for that. She's a wheelchair user, and she brought a tremendous amount of attention because of the value of her talent. They made the theater, the performance space, accessible. And they shifted the whole paradigm of how it was structured, so she could have her own dressing room, that she could get on and off the stage appropriately in her wheelchair. And it's one of the first things ever done like that. And we're talking about, how many hundreds of years of theater has existed, how many, and then 30 plus years of the ADA in existence. And yet that's only just happening, in the last couple of years. But in my discussion with Brian, I said, look, I understand, you're a marquee, meaning he's going to head a film. He's going to bring the money in. He's the face on the screen that people know. But if we don't have equal access to opportunity, equal access to education, we're never going to get to that place. A person with disability who an obvious disability like a wheelchair user is not going to get to that place without the same kind of equal access. And so we're never going to be a marquee name. So I said, in order to shift the paradigm, for every role that a person takes who's a non-disabled person taking a disabled role, they have that power to give back 3 speaking roles on screen to a performer with disability. That's going to help shift the paradigm. So I call that the Woodburn ratio. For every one that's taken away, 3 get given back. And I talked to Brian about this, and he was all for it, But I mean, I understood he had booked this job. He had agreed to this job like something like 10 or 14 years prior to actually doing it. So these are longstanding commitments that he's made. And where the industry was 14 years ago versus 6 years ago versus now is very different. But I would say that only in the last 6 years, has the paradigm changed. So when we had the Oscars in 2016, and it was the Oscars So White campaign was very prevalent, we looked at marginalized groups not getting equal access to opportunity, but there was never any mention of the disabled community. And as a result of that movement, the Motion Picture Academy indoctrinated 100 new members, and they were all people of color and women, people that have been overlooked, but none in the disability community. And so at the time, that particular president, we approached her, and she said, well, if they happen to be a wheelchair user who is a person of color, then that would be okay. So they never looked at disability as a marginalized group unless it fit into one of the categories that was, I will say, popular at the time, because that was the truth of it. It was the popular kids in the room getting the opportunity versus those who are also being marginalized.
And you moved to the East Coast recently. We were talking about before we jumped on the recording today, and I want to know a little bit about, if you want to share kind of your brother's story and some of the stuff that you're learning about the patient experience and some of the things that are going on with your brother. Tell us about that.
My brother has Down syndrome. He is what's called mosaicism of Down syndrome. He is a fairly high IQ for what he has. In fact, if he'd been maybe 2 points higher, he wouldn't qualify for a lot of the disability benefits that he qualifies for now. But the thing is, on his birthday in December, he collapsed from an aortic tear, from an aneurysm in his heart, and he was given a very limited chance to live. And he survived a surgery, and within a week, he also had another He had a heart attack, and they had to put a stent in. Then he was in atrial fib, and they had to cardiovert and shock his heart back into rhythm. Then he got COVID. This is all in the span of being in the hospital for over 5 weeks. But the threat of discharge kept coming, kept coming, kept coming. And I didn't have a place for him to go. My mother's situation had deteriorated. My mother is dealing with her own things, and her health was deteriorating. She could no longer care for him in the same way. And so I didn't have a home for him to go to. And he couldn't qualify for Medicaid in his current status, because you have to have a certain financial status to qualify for Medicaid as well. And that was, I would say, poor planning on my family's part with regard to his future. And they kept basing his discharge on the fact that he could walk 150 feet. That was it. That was the criteria. There was no other element to his care that was important. Like, he's on 11 or 12 different medications. He couldn't tell you when or if he's supposed to take what, when. He doesn't know what each of these pills are for. Half of them he can't pronounce. And so, it meant I had to put him somewhere at our expense for his care. Because now I couldn't find him unless I put him directly into a nursing home, which, my brother, to go from an independent life of somebody who can walk and take the bus and go into the city and go to the movies and go to the mall and do all of these things on his own, to now, within a span of 5 weeks, reach the point of, you're going to live in a nursing home because that's all we can do for you, was all based on him walking 150 feet. So his other existing disability is not taken into account. And he could walk 150 feet, mind you, on a walker. It wasn't that he could walk 150 feet free of a walker. It was just, it's just about being ambulatory to that point. And the disregard that insurance companies have about a person's care level is criminal, in my view. That is a blatant area, I think, of discrimination regarding people with disability. And people with disability, he has to be essentially impoverished, have less than $8,000 in his bank, not take more than $2,500 in from all sources. So he's effectively, that's not anything anybody could live on effectively for the rest of without being impoverished. So he has to have that, have no other money in order to get help from the state. And so these things aren't considered at all with regard to healthcare and discharging a patient. Now, when I was a kid, I had an arthrogram done. An arthrogram is it was a spinal X-ray with dye. All right, I was about 8, and they did this under general anesthesia. So they put me out, and then I woke up, and I wasn't in any particular pain. Although when you have a spinal, you get an instant headache. So I had, as a kid, I had a terrible headache, kind of a thing. But I was in the hospital probably for 4 days. So that was in the 70s. But now I could have a total hip replacement, and they want me out in 2 days. And they don't take into account that I might have had a different level of surgery than MIS hip surgery, MIS minimally invasive surgery. So that MIS is just, they cut a little hole, they go in, they can replace your whole hip through that little space. People usually, you have to get up the same night. You have to stay on the same night as the surgery. But, people that have that particular surgery recover faster, as opposed if you have a fully open hip replacement surgery, you're not going to be recovering faster. You're going to be recovering slower, and it's going to take, in my situation, I've had both my hips replaced now. So in my situation, I was not able to really be discharged. And it became a fight. You know, they have these administrators come in, these they like to call them patient counselors. But basically, their job is to come in and try to get you home, try to get you out of the hospital. And you know, I explained, look, I had not just this hip replacement, but the doctor also did an osteotomy. He had to reshape my whole hip area, the muscles around my hip, because I had had a number of osteotomies in my childhood, so I was different. But that's not taken into account. None of that's taken into account. They want you out of the hospital, and that's the mindset now: is get them in, get them out. You know, it doesn't matter if they're much more susceptible to infection, much more susceptible to a blood clot. I had my knee, I had a torn meniscus in my knee, had surgery, was home the same day as the torn meniscus surgery, but within a day and a half, I had a blood clot. And so that set me back. That set me back 6 to 8 weeks, 12 weeks. That set me back 12 weeks, that blood clot. So if I had stayed in the hospital a few more days, probably wouldn't have intervened with my life as much. So this is the situation that my brother's in. And you'll probably see an op-ed from me at some point called 150 feet. You know, hospitals, and the hospital my brother was in admittedly said, you know, we're not trained with regard to somebody with Down syndrome in the same way, you know, to have a full understanding of this. So I had gratefully had the foresight to get a power of attorney prior to him going into the hospital. But if I hadn't gotten that, I would have been powerless, essentially, to do all the things I was able to do for him. And so that's another sort of scary aspect, that if I didn't have that, they could have done whatever they wanted with him. You know, I wouldn't have had that control. He would have been turned over to the state. You know, I would have had to fight to get that back somehow.
Yeah.
This general disregard around, especially people with cognitive disability. You know, we adore them, and this is what I believe to be truthful about people with Down syndrome. We adore them all the way through childhood into high school, and we love to see the story of the captain of the cheerleading squad, you know, asking the boy with Down syndrome to the prom. We love to see that story. But is she gonna look in on him when he's 25, see how he's doing? You know, it's just about, you know, giving her a pat on the back. Isn't she magnanimous? And that's the way we look at disability. You know, we adore them when they're young, and we do what we can to care for them. But when they're 35, 45, 55, 61, as my brother is, a lot less so. He's not as cute as he was when he was a kid.
Danny Woodburn, I mean, this is what he's all about. This is opening up eyes to situations you don't think about. We've all read those stories, and of course, you know, happily ever after, right? What happens after happily ever after? Well, life goes on, right? And sometimes it's not so pretty, but it's reality. And Danny, you know, you've always been about telling these stories and having your voice heard, because you do have a gift of being able to explain these type of things. And I think it's been an amazing experience having you on this podcast today. I want to thank you for your time, and
Thank you,
I'm excited to get this one out there.
I appreciate it.